for having me, Ahmed Ali. So I'm just here today to talk a little bit about my work in general and also this book, which came out a couple of years ago, I guess now, which is called Don't Think for Yourself, Authority and Belief in Medieval Philosophy. It's published by University of Notre Dame Press. And it, in a way, grows out of a bigger project that I've been doing for more than 10 years now, which is called The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. And it's basically a podcast, although the podcast also appears as books. I have the books here somewhere too, but I won't dig those out right now. And the idea is to cover the entire history of philosophy in all cultures and times in podcast form and in pretty significant detail. So I've done classical Greek philosophy, later ancient philosophy, philosophy in the Islamic world, medieval Latin philosophy, Byzantine philosophy, and now I've been doing Renaissance and early modern philosophy for a while, sort of up to the end of the 16th century. And all of that stuff put together has been like 420 something episodes. I've also done series with co-authors on classical Indian philosophy and Africana philosophy, and that's another, I don't know, about 200 episodes. So it's been going on for a long time, and that project itself grew out of my kind of day job, which is to be a philosophy professor. So I'm at the LMU in Munich. I used to be at King's College London, and I'm still affiliated with them as well. And really my main research areas are late ancient philosophy. So what happened to Greek philosophy basically in the later Roman Empire, that period. So thinking about like the 3rd to the 5th or 6th century CE. And then philosophy in the Islamic world. So I work a lot on philosophy in Arabic. I've written books about several philosophers from the Islamic world like Al-Kindi and Abu Bakr al-Razi. And I've also worked quite a lot on Ibn Sina and also the reception of Ibn Sina in the Islamic world. So that's kind of what I do for a living. And most of my teaching is about ancient Greek philosophy or what we might call medieval philosophy in Arabic. I've also learned to read a bit of Persian, but unfortunately I don't have any conversational Persian, so I'm sorry about that. But I can, if you hand me a page of philosophy in Persian, I can probably make sense of it. But my Arabic's a lot better than my Persian, I have to say. So that means that I've like done a lot of different kinds of philosophy, and especially worked on lots of different authors from different cultural traditions. And so really the reason I got into the podcast project was because I thought it would be nice to present the history of philosophy to a wider audience in a way that highlighted first of all, the continuity of the history of philosophy, sort of the way that if you're thinking about history, you don't just have, the Persian Wars and then the crowning of Charlemagne and then, the Muslim invasions and then, right? So it's not just like the big events. There's history going on all the time. And historians should have an understanding about how history has unfolded continuously over time. And I think the same thing is true for the history of philosophy. So rather than jumping from one great thinker or supposedly great thinker to another, like only doing Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, Descartes, Kant, like that, I wanted to convey the idea that the history of philosophy evolves continuously over the centuries, and that there's kind of always history of philosophy going on. There's sort of always something to learn about it. And not just in Europe, but also in other cultures. So, like I said, I've done philosophy in the Islamic world. I've done classical Indian philosophy, Africana philosophy, and pretty soon, starting next year, so February 2024, we'll be doing Chinese philosophy. So I'm doing that also with a co-author. So this is like a very broad perspective on what the history of philosophy is. And one thing that I was thinking about a lot while I was doing the various medieval cultures, so this book that I'm talking about today is about philosophy in the Islamic world, but also philosophy in medieval Byzantine culture. So in other words, in the Byzantine Empire, the later Roman Empire where they speak Greek, and then obviously Latin Christendom. So I think there's a widespread assumption, kind of popular conception of philosophy in these cultures, which is that they were very authority bound. So in other words, you were supposed to stay within the guidelines of what, let's say, the church in these Christian societies demanded that everybody think, or in Islam, you're supposed to stay within some kind of bounds of well-defined orthodoxy, and if you stepped outside of that, you'd be in big trouble, right? So people tend to think that medieval philosophy is not very original, it's not very innovative, it's very kind of trapped within these set ways of thinking, and then this is why they do a lot of commenting on Aristotle or other texts, right? So they're just trying to find their way through these authoritative texts and pull out every little distinction and subtlety, and they're not really making any progress. So I think this is maybe not something people say explicitly about medieval philosophy, but it's certainly something that people kind of generally think about medieval philosophy. So the starting point of the book, for me, both thinking about it and also writing about it, is that at least in Islamic medieval culture, this is really not true at all. And you can tell that it's not true from the fact that there's a concept in classical or medieval Islam, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, which is taqlid. So taqlid, you can translate that as something like uncritical acceptance of authority. And the idea that you often find in scholars of classical Islam is that any intellectual or scholar, so any member of the ulama, as they would have put it, is someone who should be capable of making up their own minds about a range of issues. So, for example, rather than believing in Islam because they were taught to believe in Islam by their parents, let's say, or because they live in a society where everyone's Muslim, the reason that these scholars say that they're Muslims is that they've thought very hard about whether you can prove the existence of God, whether you can prove that Muhammad was a genuine prophet, and they've answered these questions with a yes. So they think that they can give you philosophical arguments for the existence of God. They think that you can show that Muhammad was a prophet, that the Quran is a genuine revelation, and they also think that they can refute other religions, like they can show that Christian theology makes no sense because the concept of the Trinity is absurd, for example. And so actually in these cultures, or at least in Islamic culture, the idea that you should be blindly following authority or uncritically following authority is actually very far from what the scholars thought. And I think the idea that scholars should be kind of responsible for their own beliefs or should make up their own minds about these very important issues is especially true in Islamic culture, but was also to some extent true in Latin and Byzantine Christianity. So there's a lot of discussion around the questions about what philosophy can do in the direction of establishing Christian theology. But a pretty standard view is at least that Christian theology can be shown to be compatible with rational argument and rational philosophy, which for them mostly meant Aristotelian philosophy, at least in the Latin context. So, as I say, the starting point from my book was really thinking about how medievals did, in fact, work with authority. So, given that they thought they shouldn't just follow authority heedlessly or uncritically, how did they think they should use authority? And one idea that I talk about, and I especially associate this with a theologian philosopher named Al-Ghazali, who lived from the 10th into the 11th into the 12th centuries CE. I'm sure you've all heard of Al-Ghazali. So this is the author of Tahafut al-Falasifa, Munhid min al-Dalal, and a whole bunch of other important texts. Like Ihya al-Ulumuddin. So Ghazali, especially in the Munhid, his intellectual autobiography, he talks about his own struggles to free himself from taqlid and to establish for himself that Islam is the correct religion. And one of the interesting things that we get here in Ghazali is the idea that you might use your own critical faculties and your ability to rationally assess certain views as a way of deciding which authorities to follow. So in other words, so he says he gives an interesting example. So he's comparing this to deciding that Muhammad is a genuine prophet. So he says this is a lot like using your own critical faculties to determine that someone is a doctor who knows what they're doing, and then seeking medical advice from that person. So I thought this is interesting because the idea is not that you should figure everything out for yourself, but nor is it that you should uncritically follow authority. The idea that Ghazali has is that you should critically follow authority, like you should establish that someone is a prophet before following them, or you should establish that someone is a qualified doctor before seeking medical advice from them. And I actually thought that this was a very important lesson for today's society, because I think a lot of problems that are going on in European and North American countries especially, but I think it's a broader phenomenon as well. So you have a lot of people sort of on the internet, you know, saying that they reject the opinion of various scientists or experts. And I think that in a way they've made the mistake of thinking that in order to avoid what in classical Islam was called taqlid, they need to go figure out everything for themselves. So that you see people on the internet saying things like, you know, go do the research. And what they mean is go look online until you find answers to questions that you might be wondering about. Like, I don't know, you know, is climate change real? Or does the COVID vaccine work? Is it safe? Questions like this. Or you might even think of conspiracy theories, right? So a lot of people who have what I would consider deviant opinions about this kind of thing, the reason why they've wound up with their deviant opinions is that they have taken too seriously the need to figure things out for themselves. So they've tried to figure it all out on their own by going on the internet, which of course is a terrible place to try to find things out in many ways, especially if you're not very good at being critical about the sources of information you're using. And so my thought was that Ghazali's advice is actually the right advice. So what he says is don't try to figure out everything for yourself, but you should still be critical. It's just that the way you should be critical is by trying to figure out which authorities you should follow. So I thought this was like a very interesting and useful idea. And that's really what the first half of the book is about. The second half of the book then looks at other manifestations of this kind of problem in medieval societies. So one thing I talk about is using reason to choose between religions. So you find like philosophical works which take the form of dialogues between members of different religions, like there will be a Jew, a Christian, and a Muslim arguing about whose religion is best. And then they try to use philosophical arguments to sort out the answer to that question. Or another thing I talk about is the rivalry between Plato and Aristotle, as both of them bidding to be the most important Greek philosopher, and how medievals tried to negotiate between the authority of these two figures. And another thing I talk about is women in medieval societies, especially and this is especially in Christian society, not so much in Islam. So I talk about the way that women authors tried to write in such a way as to get people to treat them as authoritative. So the whole book kind of circles around these issues about belief formation and authority. When do we trust authority? Under what conditions should we trust authority? How do we use authoritative advice in our own thinking? That's really the core question of the book, and then it kind of spins out from there to look at a lot of different themes in medieval philosophy.